If you're contemplating some year-end and possibly next year giving, please consider our show because we are 100% non-corporatized, independent activist news, and we need your help to keep acting out. To become a patron of our show, visit patreon.com/actout. This week on Act Out, we're talking borders and barriers. First up, did you know that the U.S. Constitution has a different border zone than the official border map of the U.S.? And what does that have to do with drones in a small town in Maine? Next up, make some noise between barriers this New Year's Eve, and here's how the U.S. now extends to 75% of the world's nations. Finally, following last week's net neutrality decision, you may be feeling down. But here is a pick-me-up that gives you the power to access the internet. No telecoms involved. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. To start off this week, we are headed to the front lines to talk headlines, lowlives, and quite a bit about drones. Brunswick, Maine, the idyllic little town of roughly 20,000 people, is setting its sights on a trailblazing position of Orwellian proportions. It wants to be the first in the U.S. to use drones to spot railroad trespassers. In the chilling article from earlier this month, the Press Herald reports that this move also would make the Brunswick Police Department the first in Maine to use drones to look for potential criminal activity rather than at a crime scene or at a crash site. Potential criminal activity. That's like pre-crime detection, which is also something I thought we already covered in that mediocre Tom Cruise movie involving a dystopian future where 3 women are enslaved in milky water for the sake of detecting crimes. Didn't work then, doesn't work now, won't work ever. And while a spokeswoman for the Railroad Administration pointed out that this technology would only be used for detection and not enforcement, A, do we believe that? And B, are we to brush off the issue of drone surveillance as a minor and insignificant issue? Are we to ignore the implications and precedents set by this in the same way that we ignored the slow rise in militarized weaponry now used by cops? And as Nicholas West pointed out in a recent article on the issue, this latest drones are for your safety shtick is not only part of a disturbing recent trend, it's a trend that we had previously placed more in line with conspiracy theories like lizard people a mere 7 years ago. I'd like to remind readers that up until 2010, it was a conspiracy theory to suggest that drones would be used in the US at all. Until, of course, it came out that there had been a domestic drone program in the works for years. Subsequently, it became understood that the border actually extends 100 miles inland through an area that the ACLU dubbed the Constitution-Free Zone. Yeah. What you think of as the border isn't really the border, it's more of like a marker for the beginning of the end of your rights plus 100 miles. These regulations actually date back to 1953 when the DOJ established this 100-mile border zone without any public comment or debate. Fast forward to today, and not only do we have 20 times the number of Border Patrol agents on the prowl, but the technology with which they now police those areas has obviously expanded as well. Now includes watchlist and database systems, such as the Automated Targeting System Traveler Risk Assessment Program, advanced identification and tracking systems, including electronic passports, and intrusive technological schemes such as the virtual border fence and unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones. With many of these technologies in the hands of private companies, there are powerful financial incentives for the continued militarization of the border zone. What? You mean people are making bank off of oppressing others? Well, I never. And considering that roughly 2/3 of the U.S. population lives within 100 miles of a U.S. land or coastal border, you, along with 200 million other Americans, are actually subject to federal border agents stopping, interrogating, and searching Americans on an everyday basis with absolutely no suspicion of wrongdoing, and often in ways that our Constitution does not permit. Plus drone surveillance. Because America, and because money. Makes you feel a lot safer, doesn't it? Of course not. And that's just the point. It's not supposed to make you feel safe. It's supposed to make you feel scared. Scared to live outside the confines of the dutiful prole who works and consumes and works and consumes. And it sure as shit is designed to make you fear dissent in any form or fashion. But don't let it. Don't let their fascist Orwellian moves freeze you. Don't let their cries of terrorism and safety quiet your drive to resist, build, and fight back. And in that same vein, for those of you, like myself, that often feel meh about New Year's Eve, here's a loud act of solidarity to engage in rather than overpriced drinks and overestimated parties. The revolutionary anti-fascist platform It's Going Down recently published a call for a raucous night of strong solidarity with those imprisoned by the state on one of the noisiest nights of the year. The post asks people to gather outside of prisons to demonstrate around the US and indeed the globe, not only in an act of solidarity, but as a reminder and inspiration to push for a, quote, world free from domination. And speaking of world domination, our final headline this week comes from 149 nations across the globe, roughly 75% of the nation's countries, where U.S. Special Operations Forces are currently deployed. In a record-setting jump, this new administration has upped the ante on overseas special forces combat. Of course, without actually, declaring war. William Hartung, the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy, told Tom Dispatch that the increase in the use of special forces since 9/11 was part of what was then referred to as the global war on terror, as a way to keep the United States active militarily in areas beyond its two main wars, being Iraq and Afghanistan. The even heavier reliance on special forces during the Obama years was part of a strategy of what I think of as politically sustainable warfare, in which the deployment of tens of thousands of troops to a few key theaters of war was replaced by a lighter footprint in more places, using drones, arms sales and training, and special forces. And the drones we meet again. In other words, how can we perpetuate war without actually ever declaring it, so as to perpetuate arms sales, resource extraction, and a pithy attempt at global hegemony? And as we saw with Afghanistan having trained bin Laden and al-Qaeda, we have a robust track record of training the troops that we then turn around and shoot at due to our ever-shifting political alliances based on contrived conflict and a dangerously bloated sense of self-importance. While our politicians smack of anti-terrorism efforts, our goals have never been and aren't currently about stabilizing any of the 149 countries that we send troops to. Indeed, in the interest of perpetual war, you gotta have perpetual enemies. In a Lockheed Martin earnings call from January of 2015, Lockheed Chief Executive Marilyn Hewson responded to a question about the upcoming Iran deal affecting Lockheed's bottom line. Hewson stressed that volatility all around the region should continue to bring new business. According to Hewson, a lot of volatility, a lot of instability, a lot of things that are happening in both the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific region means both are growth areas for Lockheed Martin. No amount of peace deals will dampen the war drive, as Smedley Butler remarked. You gotta take the profit out of war. Until then, it's all just well-meaning, but ultimately useless fluff. And if you're wondering whether our Congress, the same Congress that this year voted to give Trump unlimited military power, if you're wondering whether they are on the case, think again. Almost by definition, the dizzying number of deployments undertaken by U.S. Special Operations Forces in recent years would be hard to track. But few in Congress seem to be even making the effort, said William Hartung. This is a colossal mistake if one is concerned about reining in the globe-spanning U.S. military strategy of the post-9/11 era, which has caused way more harm than good and done little to curb terrorism. Our freedom crusades march on, and Congress is only far too happy to watch from their gilded sidelines. Unless we can build and bolster a viable anti-war, pro-peace movement, we too will watch from our far less than gilded sidelines as our government manifests a global graveyard in our name. Now, shifting from death and destruction to something a bit less morbid, I want to talk internet. Now, I know that after last week, many of you feel deflated. The net neutrality loss was indeed a blow to both digital rights and free speech, but hold on a sec. because the battle to save the net is far from over. As I speak, court cases are in motion, in part arguing that the recent FCC decision to repeal net neutrality violates federal laws barring agencies from crafting arbitrary and capricious regulations. Meanwhile, Team Internet is urging Congress to overturn the FCC decision, which they have the power to do via the Congressional Review Act. Talks are also ongoing regarding legislation for internet equality and freedom, demanding and drafting a new bill along the lines of the National Improved Medicare for All bill, basically a bill that would clearly define our rights to a free and open internet. And while I absolutely think that people need to plug into these paths of resistance, there is a legitimate concern regarding their efficacy, namely that they require congressional action. Furthermore, they continue to rely on the big telecom companies that, well, they got us into this clusterfuck in the first place, didn't they? Which leaves us with the question, is there another way? And if so, what is it? Well, here to answer that question and dissect the details of public or municipal broadband is Evan Malmgren, researcher, editor, and writer specializing in the politics of digital technology and communications media. Take a look.
Municipal broadband would be a broadband, preferably a fiber network that is built, owned by a municipal government, and in many cases an electric utility. Which, by the way, having an electric utility run a broadband network is a great idea because not only does that ensure that it's going to connect to every home and business if it's on the back of the electrical grid, but you can actually connect them so that there's the electrical grid itself has internet connection, and you can get instant data off of it. You can reroute power more easily, reduce the duration of outages. But yes, so that would be a municipal broadband network, would be one specifically built and run by a municipal government, whereas public broadband, I'm using a bit more loosely. That could also, be like a county broadband network, or if there's nothing like this that exists, but like one run by a state, for example, or a rural electric cooperative.
Do you feel that municipal is the best? The smaller the locale, the better?
So most of the public broadband networks that exist in the United States are in pretty small municipalities. I think that this sort of mid-sized city, smaller city is actually a great place to start doing this kind of thing, because the investment is not so huge that the initial investment's not going to be so huge that it's totally overwhelming, but the market's going to be large enough to actually sustain the network and make it profitable. And then from there, it can actually grow out into expanding communities and start to serve outlying towns and rural areas. This is actually something that was happening organically, not just in Chattanooga, but outside of Wilson, North Carolina, with their municipal broadband network. They were starting to service outlying towns, outlying counties, and rural communities, just organically responding to demand because their networks are so great. And the states shut that down. They caved to essentially lobbying pressure from the ISPs. I think that for a long time, internet service providers have hidden behind this veil of complexity. People don't know how they work. People don't understand how they're regulated. And that allows them to get away with a lot because there's not very much public energy around this issue for the most part.
So with that, and being that net neutrality is a regulatory issue, you had mentioned that you feel like it's kind of obtuse, it's a bit abstract. Do you feel that net neutrality, if regulation was a path that made sense, do you feel that net neutrality would be a good way of regulating the ISPs?
So certainly I think that net neutrality is a good thing, but there's a lot of things that it doesn't address, right? So for example, networks can still tamper with bandwidth for quote unquote network management purposes, which is this is very opaque. We don't really know exactly when they're doing this or to what extent they're doing it or who they're favoring. So because of that, net neutrality is arguably, if not unenforceable, then at least very difficult to enforce. And under an FCC such as the one that we currently have led by Occupy, the truth is net neutrality protections, probably are not going to be enforced very aggressively anyway. They also allow for a practice called zero rating, where service providers can allow certain content to not count towards people's data caps. So for instance, like you get free Netflix streaming or Comcast might make it so that their video services don't count towards your data caps. So these kinds of loopholes allow for uh, ISPs to do the kinds of things that net neutrality activists are worried about anyway. The spirit of the regulation is already being violated. So I absolutely think that net neutrality is a good thing, as it was enforced previously. But I also think that it's certainly not enough, and that it's very difficult to cover all of those bases through just blunt regulations when the ISPs are constantly trying to find backdoors and they move much quicker than legislators. Um, yeah.
So, and do you feel like this could also be a scale issue? Because this past week, a California senator announced his plans to propose a statewide net neutrality law. Do you feel that something like that could work because it's not on a federal level, it's rather on a state level, or do you think it's still not enough?
I think that I think that this is a good thing. Like I would say that that's a good idea, but I would say that pushing for statewide net neutrality regulations, I see as kind of a retreat from the idea of a federal regulation. And I think that that's not the best place to divert the energy that has been built up around net neutrality um, writ large. It's not into implementing net neutrality regulations at a state level and getting involved in this mosh pit of special interests, on Capitol Hill and in state legislations. Uh, so that's why I've advocated and strongly believe that instead we should be pushing for more direct public control of that last mile infrastructure of broadband networks, being run directly by bodies that are held accountable to the public.
And talk about that last mile. What do you exactly mean by that last mile of connectivity?
There's this what they call the backbone, which is this um, deeper, larger cable networks that essentially connect to what you can think of as regional access points, and then that last mile infrastructure. That's what's built out by um, Charter, Verizon, AT&T, the internet service providers, connects essentially from an access point to the backbone to homes and businesses. And so one of the reasons that I think that this makes the most sense to bring under to emphasize in terms of trying to democratize control of internet access is because this is the part that directly touches people's lives, right? People deal with AT&T. They pay bills to Comcast. It connects directly to their home, and it's the part of the network that they see and understand. And I think that it's the most easy to conceptualize, taking control of that part of the network. Right.
And the infrastructure before that last mile, that is publicly financed, correct?
It was at one point in time, and then it was essentially given to private corporations with very little incentive for them to give much back.
So let's shift to, because this is always going to be the question, the money question. And you mentioned in an article how expensive it is to create competition against those monopolies, which brings up the question of local governments, because local governments are the ones who say, well, in order to access that, that pole connection, you have to pay this much money. So is it a local government issue? Is it a telecom issue? Is it both?
In terms of how difficult it is for new competitors to break into markets, I would say it's both. I mean, so to the extent that it's an issue of local governments impeding competition in local markets, I would say that's mostly because local governments are making rational decisions, which is, when you think of any kind of network infrastructure, sewage systems, electric networks, trains, it doesn't make sense to have overlapping networks that don't connect with each other. You can think of I live in New York. In New York City, the subway system used to be run at the beginning of the 20th century by two private companies that didn't connect with each other, right? And this is very inefficient. It makes people have longer commutes. It makes them have to pay more. And eventually, the city built out its own system and bought the private networks, which at that point weren't even profitable, because competition doesn't make sense with this kind of network infrastructure. It just creates this costly redundancy and inefficiency, and it's bad for consumers. And so what you do see in competition in broadband among broadband providers, the most competition is among the wealthiest markets, because those are the people who are going to possibly pay more money for a higher quality connection. So if you're a small provider trying to compete in a chartered legacy market is a very difficult thing to do. You're not going to invest in poorer areas. You're going to invest in the wealthiest areas. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault. That's just the nature of what competition looks like in this kind of infrastructure, right? So you end up with legacy providers having very little reason to invest in poorer areas, and people are stuck paying top rates for uh, old, low quality connections that are, comparable to DSL.
And to play devil's advocate for a second here, and I do mean devil's advocate, the private versus public debate. A recent article in Wired basically gave the capitalism argument to this public broadband issue, and it hinged on deregulation, which would allow the private sector to build broadband in the areas rather than making it a public utility, and it argued that making it a public utility would cost the people more and be a worse product because, the private sector knows how to do it. They're the experts. Why not bring the experts in? What would be your response to that?
So this is actually kind of similar to what you can think of San Francisco is doing with their dark fiber network that they're building out. So um, San Francisco has pledged to build a fiber network that's going to connect to every home and business in the city, and it's going to be owned and built by the city. But then they're going to lease that infrastructure out to private companies who are basically going to set rates and have markets determine pricing. Um, to me, I, I, this just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If you're saying that we need to have a public government involved directly to ensure the quality and universal access to this infrastructure, and then the end of it is just trying to make a profit off of it. Like I think that providing internet access just shouldn't be thought in terms of optimizing profit maximization, right? I mean, that's exactly the problem. That's exactly how we've ended up in this horribly unequal distribution of internet access. And I just don't think that that's a good framework for thinking about something that's becoming such an essential service to people's lives. Historically, it just hasn't worked out in the public interest. I mean, I think this is something where there's a lot of examples you can point to. One of the most prominent being, again, I'm in New York. Here we have FiOS. Everyone's familiar with Verizon's fiber optic network. That in 2008, the city made an agreement with Verizon. They gave them a exclusive contract, and Verizon was going to build out a fiber network to every home and business. So 9 years later, the city's now suing Verizon for failing to complete that, and that's because even if it's in writing, even if this has been these partnerships just never work out in the public interest, and the public side ends up being the junior partner who's essentially facilitating a private network, uh, taking control of a market, and then that private provider still doesn't act in the public interest because at the end of the day, they are trying to get a profit out of everything.
So how do you facilitate public broadband when you have these big corporate barriers?
Actually, some of the strongest barriers to implementing municipal broadband schemes are not necessarily private providers or private competition from private networks, but actually the control that those providers have over state legislation. So, for instance, there are laws blocking, preventing, or otherwise discouraging the construction of public networks in 21 states in the country right now. Um, how do you overcome that? I think that it is going to take a lot of political energy especially at the local level, and a lot of awareness of the extent to which internet service providers are not just acting against people's best interest, but have also taken control of a lot of the legislative tools to entrench themselves.
So what would you say are the next steps? I mean, we're kind of in uh, an interesting. We're at a crossroads here where a lot of people are pushing for like the Congress to overturn the FCC decision via the CRA. Free Press has instituted some lawsuits against the FCC saying that they went about this whole decision inappropriately. People are even pushing for, federal legislation, kind of in the same vein as the National Improved Medicare for All Act, basically dictating that the internet is free access to the internet is a right that we have to uphold. What do you feel are the next steps then for this, in particular the public broadband fight?
Well, so first of all, I want to emphasize that I don't think any of the things that you just listed are bad per se. Like I'm all for stricter net neutrality regulations. I just think that it's not enough and it doesn't address the root problem. I think the exciting thing about all the energy built up around net neutrality is that people are, in many cases, for the first time, starting to think about the extent to which this small core of corporate oligarchs control the way that we're able to access and use this amazing resource, the internet. So I think that as far as building out public broadband, that's going to be a much more local struggle, right? And I think that that's actually kind of a good thing because that allows people to connect more directly with the issue rather than on this abstract level as it has been with net neutrality. So for instance, if you wanted to try to push for a public broadband network in your community, the first step might be going to meetings with city councilors and trying to lobby for, maybe a first step would be passing a resolution to contract someone for a year to investigate what it would take to build a municipal network in your area, right? Another thing would be learning about the laws that prohibit the expansion of public broadband projects in your state. So like I said, 21 states in the country currently have laws like this on the books. So you can research those. You can lobby for state legislators to roll those back, right? I mean, I think that for there to be a lot of momentum on this, there needs to be demand for it. And I think that the opening that this net neutrality moment creates is people feeling upset about how much power these corporations have over the internet and wanting to take that back.
To learn more about the municipal and public broadband movement, check out our site list at the end of the show and in the show description, including muninetworks.org, where you can find a community toolkit and more information on the public broadband movement. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Next week, we'll be airing a best of episode to say goodbye to 2017 and get you inspired for the coming year of fighting and building. We'll be off the following week, so we will see you with a brand new episode in the new year in the second week of January. In the meantime, please spread and share this episode and others with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide and the show description to see the sites mentioned in this week's show. And for more frequent updates, be sure to follow us on social media. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your pussy sucked my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for one.